The Wind in the Willows. Chapter 1. The Riverbank. The mole had been working very hard all the morning, spring cleaning. First with brooms, then with dusters, then on ladders and steps and chairs, till he had dust in his throat and eyes, and an aching back and weary arms. Spring was moving in the air above and in the air below and around him, even his dark and lowly little house. It was small wonder, then, that he suddenly flung down his brush on the floor, said no more spring cleaning, and bolted out of the house without even waiting to put on his coat. Something above was calling him. So he scraped and scraped and scratched and scraped, working busily with his little paws and muttering, up we go, till at last, pop. His snout came out into the sunlight, and he found himself rolling in the warm grass of a green meadow. The sunshine struck hot on his fur and soft breezes soothed his heated brow. He rambled busily through the meadows. Birds were building nests, flowers were budding, everything was happy. His happiness was complete when suddenly he stood by the edge of a river. He had never seen a river before. It was chasing and chuckling, gripping things with a gurgle and leaving them with a laugh. The mole was delighted. He sat on the bank while the river chattered to him. It was the finest sound he had ever heard. A dark hole in the riverbank opposite caught his eye. As he gazed, something bright and small seemed to twinkle in the heart of it like a tiny star. Then as he looked, it winked at him. It was an eye. A small face gradually began to grow around it. A little brown face, with whiskers. It had small neat ears and thick silky hair. It was the water rat. "Hello, mole," said the water rat. "Hello, rat," said the mole. The rat stepped onto a little boat that Mole had not observed. It was painted blue outside and white within and was just the size for two animals. Mole's whole heart went out to it at once. The rat rowed across smartly. Then he held up his forepaw as the mole stepped gingerly down. "Lean on that," he said. "Now then, step lively." And the mole, to his surprise, found himself seated in a real boat. "This has been a wonderful day," said he, as the rat shoved off. "Do you know, I've never been in a boat before." "What?" cried the rat, open-mouthed. "Never been, you never will. What have you been doing then?" "Is it so nice as all that?" asked the mole shyly. "Nice?" "It's the only thing," said the water rat dreamily. "Believe me, my young friend, there is absolutely nothing half so much fun as being in a boat." Absorbed in his new life, in the sparkle, the ripple, the scents, the sounds, and the sunlight, the mole trailed upon the water and daydreamed. "I beg your pardon," said the mole, pulling himself together with an effort. "You must think me very rude, but all this is so new to me." "So, this is a river?" "The river," corrected the rat. "And you really live by the river?" "What a jolly life!" "What lies over there?" asked the mole, waving a paw toward a background of dark trees on one side of the river. "That's just the wild wood," said the rat shortly. "We don't go there very much, we riverbankers." Aren't they very nice people in there?" said the mole, a bit nervously. "Well," replied the rat, "let me see. The squirrels are all right, but the rabbits are a mixed lot. And then there's Badger, of course. Nobody interferes with him." "They had better not," he said significantly. "And, of course there are others," continued the rat in a hesitating sort of way. "Weasels and stoats and foxes and so on. They're all right in a way, but there's no denying it, well, you can't really trust them, and that's the fact." The mole knew well that an animal with good manners does not dwell on possible trouble ahead, so he dropped the subject. "And beyond the wild wood?" the mole asked. "It looks all blue and dim, and one sees what may be hills and something like the smoke of towns, or is only a cloud drift." "Beyond the wild wood comes the human world," said the rat, and that's something that doesn't matter either to you or to me. I've never been there and I'm never going, nor you either, if you've got any sense. Now then. We're going to lunch. The rat brought the boat alongside the bank, tied it up, helped awkward Mole safely ashore, and swung out the picnic basket. The mole begged to be allowed to unpack it all by himself. He took out all the mysterious packets one by one and arranged their contents, gasping "Oh my! Oh my!" at each fresh surprise. When all was ready, the rat said, "Now dig in, old fellow," and the mole was very glad to obey, for he had started his spring cleaning at a very early hour and was now quite hungry. Chapter 2. New Friends and a New Life. "What are you looking at?" said the rat, when the edge of their hunger was somewhat dulled. "I am looking," said the mole, "at a streak of bubbles that I see traveling along the surface of the water." Suddenly, a flat glistening nose showed itself above the edge of the bank, and the otter pulled himself out and shook the water from his coat. "How greedy!" he cried. "Why didn't you invite me, Ratty?" "This was an unplanned lunch," explained the rat. "By the way, meet my friend Mr. Mole." "Proud, I'm sure," said the otter, and the two animals were friends. There was a rustle behind them coming from a hedge where last year's leaves still clung thick. A stripy head, with high shoulders behind it, popped out. "Come on, old badger," shouted the rat. The badger trotted forward a pace or two, then grunted, "Company," and turned his back and disappeared from view. "That's just the sort of fellow he is," observed Rat. "He simply hates society." "Well, tell us, who's out on the river?" "Toad's out, for one," replied the otter. "In his brand new racing boat, new clothes, new everything." Otter and Rat looked at each other and laughed. "Once it was nothing but sailing," said the rat. "Then he tired of that and took to racing. Whatever he takes up, he gets tired of it and starts something fresh." "Such a good fellow, too," remarked the otter. "But no stability, especially in a boat. Did I ever tell you the story about Toad and that time when he—" But no one heard the end of the story that day. Just then, a flea swerved unsteadily above the river. There was a swirl of water, and a cloop, and the fly was gone. So was Otter. The mole looked down. There was a streak of bubbles on the surface of the water. The rat hummed a tune, and Mole remembered that animal manners forbid any sort of comment on the sudden disappearance of one's friends at any moment. The afternoon sun was getting low as the rat rode gently homeward in a dreamy mood, murmuring poetry over to himself, and not paying much attention to Mole. But the mole was very full of lunch and self-satisfaction and already quite at home in a boat, so he thought. He was getting a bit restless besides, and soon said, "Ratty, please, I want to row, now." The rat shook his head, with a smile. "Not yet, my young friend," he said. "Wait till you've had a few lessons. It's not as easy as it looks." The mole was quiet for a minute or two. But he began to feel more and more jealous of Rat, rowing so strongly and so easily along. His pride began to whisper that he could do it every bit as well. He jumped up and seized the oars so suddenly that the rat, who was gazing out over water, was taken by surprise and fell backward off his seat with his legs in the air. "Stop it, you silly fool!" cried the rat, from the bottom of the boat. "You can't do it! You'll tip us over!" The mole flung his oars back with a flourish, and made a great dig at the water. He missed the surface altogether, his legs flew up above his head, and he found himself lying on top of the rat. Greatly alarmed, he made a grab at the side of the boat, and the next moment splish! Over went the boat, and the mole found himself struggling in the river. Oh my, how cold the water was, and oh how very wet it felt! How it sang in his ears as he went down, down, down! Then a firm paw gripped him by the back of his neck. It was the rat, and he was laughing. At least the mole could feel him laughing, right down his arm and through his paw, and into Mole's neck. The rat got hold of an oar and shoved it under the mole's arm. Then he did the same by the other side of him and, swimming behind, propelled the helpless animal to shore. He hauled him out and set him down on the bank, a squashy lump of misery. So the dismal mole, wet without and ashamed within, trotted about the bank till he was fairly dry. The rat plunged into the water again, recovered the boat and turned it over, and dived successfully for the picnic basket. When they were ready to go again, Mole, limp and dejected, took his seat in the stern of the boat and said in a low voice, broken with emotion, "Ratty, my generous friend, I am very sorry for my foolish and ungrateful conduct." "That's all right," responded the rat cheerily. "What's a little wet to a water rat? Don't you think any more about it. And look here, I really think you had better come and stop with me for a little time. I'll teach you to row and to swim, and you'll soon be as handy on the water as any of us." When they got home, the rat made a bright fire in the parlor, and planted the mole in an armchair in front of it. He fetched down a dressing gown and slippers for him, and told him river stories till supper time. Very thrilling stories they were, too, to an earth-dwelling animal such as Mole. This day was only the first of many similar ones for the mole. He came to live with the rat for a while. There he learned to swim and to row and to listen to the wind whispering in the reeds. He came to know the joy of the river. Chapter 3. The Open Road. "Ratty," said the mole suddenly, one bright summer morning, "I want to ask you a favor." The rat was sitting on the river bank, singing a little song. Since the early morning, he had been swimming in the river in company with his friends the ducks. "What I wanted to ask you was, won't you take me to call on Mr. Toad? I've heard so much about him, and I do so want to meet him." "Why, certainly," said the good-natured rat, jumping to his feet. "Get the boat out, and we'll paddle up there at once. It's never the wrong time to call on Toad. Always good-tempered, always glad to see you, always sorry when you go. He must be a very nice animal," observed the mole, as he got into the boat and took the oars. Rat settled himself comfortably in the stern. "He is indeed the best of animals," replied Rat. "Perhaps he's not very clever, and it may be that he is both boastful and conceited, but Toady has got some great qualities." Rounding a bend in the river, they came in sight of a handsome, dignified old house of mellowed red brick, with well-kept lawns reaching down to the water's edge. "There's Toad Hall," said the rat, "and that creek on the left, where the notice board says private. And no landing allowed, leads to the boathouse where we'll leave the boat. The stables are over there to the right. That's the banquet hall you're looking at now, very old that is. Toad is rather rich, you know, and this is really one of the nicest houses in these parts, though we never admit as much to Toad." They glided up the creek and passed into the shadow of a large boathouse. Here they saw many beautiful boats, slung from the crossbeams or hauled up on a slip, but none in the water. The rat looked around. "I wonder what new fad he has taken up now. We shall hear all about it quite soon enough." They strolled across the lawns in search of Toad, whom they presently happened upon resting in a garden chair with a large map spread out on his knees. "Hooray!" he cried, jumping up on seeing them. "This is splendid!" He shook the paws of both of them warmly, never waiting for an introduction to Mole. "I was just going to send a boat down the river for you, Ratty. You don't know how lucky it is, you're turning up just now." "Let's sit quiet a bit, Toady," said the rat, throwing himself into an easy chair, while the mole took another by the side of him. "Now, look there," Toad said. "You've got to help me. It's most important." "It's about your rowing, I suppose," said the rat with an innocent air. With a great deal of patience and some expert coaching, you may dash. Oh, pooh! Boating, interrupted the toad, in great disgust. I've given that up long ago. Sheer waste of time, that's what it is. No, I've discovered the real thing, the only true occupation for a lifetime. Come with me, dear Ratty, and your friend also, if you will be so very good, just as far as the stable yard. He led the way to the stable yard accordingly, the rat following with a most distrustful expression. There, in front of the coach house, they saw a shiny and new horse-drawn carriage. It had red wheels and was painted canary yellow with a green trim. There you are, cried the toad. There's real life for you. The open road, the dusty highway. The whole world before you and a horizon that's always changing. And mind, this is the finest cart of its sort that was ever built. Come inside and look at the details. Planned 'em all myself, I did. It was indeed very compact and comfortable. Little sleeping bunks, a little table that folded up against a wall, a cooking stove, lockers, bookshelves, a bird cage with a bird in it, and pots, pans, jugs, and kettles of every size and variety. All complete, said the toad triumphantly. You'll find that nothing has been forgotten when we make our start this afternoon. I beg your pardon, said the rat slowly, as he chewed a straw, but did I overhear you say something about we and start and this afternoon? Now, you dear old good Ratty, said Toad, don't begin talking in that stiff and sniffy kind of way. I want to show you the whole world. I'm going to make an animal of you, my boy. I don't care, said the rat stubbornly, quite displeased with Toad's sudden change of heart toward boating. I'm not coming, and that's flat. And what's more, Mole's going to stick by me, aren't you, Mole? Of course I am, said the Mole loyally. I'll always stick with you, Rat. But it sounds as if it might have been, well, rather fun, you know. The rat saw what was passing in his mind, and wavered. He hated disappointing people, and he was fond of Mole, and would do almost anything to make him happy. Toad was watching both of them very closely. Come along in and have some lunch, he said diplomatically, and we'll talk it over. I only want to give pleasure to you fellows. Live for others. That's my motto in life. During lunch, which was excellent, of course everything at Toad Hall always was Toad painted the prospects of the trip and the joys of the open life and the roadside in such glowing colors that the Mole could hardly sit in his chair for excitement. The rat, though still unconvinced, allowed his good nature to override his personal objections. He could not bear to disappoint his two friends, who were already planning out each day's adventures for several weeks ahead. Chapter 4. The Motor Car's Spell. Once the horse was harnessed, they set off, all talking at once. It was a golden afternoon. The smell of the dust they kicked up was rich and satisfying. Out of thick orchards on either side of them, birds whistled to them cheerily, and rabbits, sitting at their front doors in the bushes, held up their forepaws and said, "Oh my! Oh my! Oh my!" Late in the evening, tired and happy, they drew up to a remote field, turned the horse loose to graze, and ate their simple supper sitting on the grass. Toad talked about all he was going to do in the days to come, while stars grew fuller and larger all around them. A yellow moon, appearing suddenly and silently from nowhere in particular, came to keep them company and listen to their talk. At last, they turned into their little bunks in the cart. After so much open air and excitement, the Toad slept very soundly, and no amount of shaking could rouse him out of bed next morning. So the rat saw to the horse and lit a fire while the Mole trudged off to the nearest village for milk and eggs, which the Toad had, of course, forgotten. The hard work had all been done, and the two animals were resting by the time Toad appeared on the scene, fresh and relaxed. He remarked what a pleasant, easy life it was they were all leading now, after leaving the cares and worries and fatigues of housekeeping at home. They had a pleasant ramble that day. It was not until afternoon that they came out on the high road, and their disaster sprang out on them. They were strolling along easily. The mole was by the horse's head, talking to him, since the horse had complained that he was being frightfully left out of it. The toad and the water rat were walking behind the cart talking together when far behind them they heard a faint warning hum, like the drone of a distant bee. Glancing back, they saw a cloud of dust with a dark center of energy. It was advancing on them at incredible speed, while from the dust a faint poop-poop sound wailed like an uneasy animal in pain. In an instant, the peaceful scene was changed. The poop-poop sound rang with a brazen shout in their ears. They had a moment's glimpse of a piece of glittering plate glass, and a magnificent motor car, its driver tense and hugging his wheel, blinded them with a cloud of dust and then dwindled to a speck in the far distance. The old gray horse, dreaming as he plodded along, simply abandoned himself to his natural emotions. Rearing, plunging, backing steadily, he drove the cart backward toward the deep ditch at the side of the road. There was a terrible crash and the canary-colored cart lay on its side in the ditch. The rat danced up and down in the road in anger. "You villains," he shouted, shaking both fists. "You scoundrels, you road hogs. I'll have the law after you. I'll report you. I'll take you through the courts." Toad sat straight down in the middle of the dusty road, his legs stretched out before him, and stared in the direction of the disappearing motor car. His breath was short, his face wore a satisfied expression, and at intervals he faintly murmured, "Poop poop." The mole was busy trying to quiet the horse, which he succeeded in doing after a time. Then he went to look at the cart, on its side in the ditch. It was indeed a sorry sight, windows smashed, axles hopelessly bent, one wheel off, and sardine tins scattered. The rat came to help him, but even together they could not lift up the cart. "Hey, Toad," they cried. "Come and lend a hand." The toad didn't answer or budge from his seat in the road. Rat and Mole found him in a sort of trance, a happy smile on his face, his eyes still fixed on the dusty trail of their destroyer. He was still heard to whisper, "Poop poop." "What are we to do with him?" asked the mole of the water rat. "Nothing at all," replied the rat firmly. "He has got a new craze, and it always takes him this way, in its first stage. He'll continue like that for days now, like an animal walking in a happy dream. He will be quite useless for practical purposes. Never mind him." The rat knotted the horse's reins over his back and took him by the head, carrying the birdcage that had fallen from the cart in his other hand. "Come on," he said grimly to the mole. "It's 5 or 6 miles to the nearest town, and we shall just have to walk." They had not gone very far on their way, however, when there was a pattering of feet behind them, and Toad caught up and thrust a paw inside the elbow of each of them. "Now look here, Toad," said the rat sharply. "As soon as we get to the town, you'll have to go to the police station and lodge a complaint against it. And then you'll have to arrange for the cart to be picked up and fixed." "Police station. Complaint," murmured Toad dreamily. "Me complain of that beautiful, that heavenly vision. Fix the cart. I'm done with carts forever. Oh, Ratty! You can't think how thankful I am to you for coming on this trip. I wouldn't have gone without you, and I might never have seen that swan, that sunbeam, that thunderbolt." The rat turned from him in despair. "You see," he said to the mole, addressing him across Toad's head, "he's quite hopeless. I give it up. When we get to town we'll go to the railway station, and with any luck we may pick up a train that will get us back to Riverbank tonight. And if you ever catch me going along with this crazy animal again—" He snorted. The following evening, Mole was sitting on the bank fishing when the rat came strolling along to find him. "Heard the news?" he said. "There's nothing else being talked about, all along the riverbank. Toad went up to town on an early train this morning. He has ordered a very large and very expensive motor car. Chapter 5. The Wild Wood. The mole had long wanted to meet the badger. But whenever he mentioned his wish to the water rat, he always found himself put off. "It's all right," the rat would say. "Badger will turn up some day or other and then I'll introduce you. The best of fellows. But you must take him not only as you find him, but when you find him." "Couldn't you ask him for dinner or something?" said the mole. "He wouldn't come," replied the rat simply. "Badger hates society, and invitations, and dinner, and all that sort of thing." "Well, then supposing we go and call on him," suggested the mole. "Oh, I'm sure he wouldn't like that at all," said the rat, quite alarmed. "He'd be quite offended. Besides, he lives in the very middle of the wild wood." "Well," said the mole, "you told me the wild wood was all right, you know." "Oh, I know," the rat said, trying to avoid the subject. "But it's a long way, and he wouldn't be home at this time of year anyhow. He'll be coming along someday, if you'll wait quietly." The mole had to be content with this. And it was not till summer was long over, and the cold and frost kept them indoors, and the swollen river raced past outside their windows, that he found his thoughts once again drifting toward old Badger. In the winter time, the mole had a great deal of spare time on his hands. And so one afternoon, when the rat was dozing in his armchair before the blaze, he decided to go out by himself and explore the wild wood, and perhaps look in on Mr. Badger. It was a cold still afternoon with a steely sky overhead when he slipped out of the warm parlor into the open air. The country lay bare and entirely leafless around him. All the hidden places that had been mysterious in leafy summer were now exposed. Mole liked the country like this, undecorated, hard, and stripped of its finery. With great cheerfulness he pushed on toward the wild wood, which lay before him low and threatening, like a black reef in a deep southern sea. There was nothing to alarm him at first entry. Twigs cracked under his feet, logs tripped him, but he moved farther into the woods, to where the light was less. The trees crouched nearer and nearer, and holes in their trunks made ugly mouths at him on either side. Everything was still now. The dusk advanced on him steadily, rapidly, gathering in behind and ahead. The light seemed to be draining away. Then the faces began. It was over his shoulder that he first thought he saw a face, a little wedge-shaped face, looking at him from a hole. When he turned, the thing had vanished. He passed another hole, and another, and another, and then yes, certainly a little narrow face with hard eyes had flashed up for an instant from a hole, and was gone. He hesitated and walked on. Then suddenly, every hole, far and near, and there were hundreds of them, seemed to possess its own face, coming and going rapidly, all hard-eyed and evil and sharp. Then the whistling began. Very faint and shrill it was, and far behind him when he first heard it, but somehow it made him hurry forward. Then, still very faint and shrill, it sounded far ahead of him. Mole didn't know which way to turn, and soon the sound broke out on either side of him. They were up and alert and ready, whoever they were. Mole was far from any help, and the night was closing in. Then the pattering began. He thought it was only falling leaves at first, so soft and delicate was the sound of it. Then as it grew, he knew it was the pat-pat-pat of little feet. Was it in front or behind? It grew and then it multiplied as he listened in fear, leaning this way and that. It seemed to be closing in on him. The whole wood seemed to be running now, running hard, hunting, chasing, closing in.